welcome to Mental Health Matters, another great episode coming to you from St. Louis Counseling, stlouiscounseling.org, spell out Saint. So once again, this is Tom Duff. I am the host of Mental Health Matters and also the executive director of St. Louis Counseling, which is here in the St. Louis metro area. And as always, we try to have a podcast that promotes the breakdown of stigma when it comes to mental health issues, as well as educating and informing our listeners on various different topics. So, first I'm gonna give out a little pitch for St. Louis Counseling. As I said, I'm the executive director there. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, so I have that heart of a therapist, but the mind of a business person. But that is my world right now. But hey, on May 1st is Give STL Day. So think of us on that day. Our goal is to get as many $300 matches as we can, because we know that the funding never meets the total need of clients. So, every year we end up doing a lot of free services for individuals, and we believe we have to fulfill some of those sessions obligations when we're in the middle of treatment, but sometimes the funding runs out. So we are very excited this year. We have a campaign. We have a board of directors who's collectively put up $300, and now we're trying to get as many businesses and individuals to figure out how they can also give $300, which provides 4 sessions for a child during the course of a month, or maybe more than a month. But bottom line is, if you are interested, if you know somebody else that may be interested, contact us. And you can contact us, Debbie Dugan, our business development and marketing director, and her email address is ddugan, D-U-G-A-N, at ccstl.org. Once again, that's D-U-G-A-N at ccstl.org. Hey, also, if you want to be a sponsor of the podcast, feel free to reach out to Debbie, same email address. But, maybe you want to get in on this and provide a little bit of sponsorship, maybe $100 a month, because, of course, there is a price to doing this. We feel it's important. We're going to keep doing it. But maybe you, as an individual, you as a business, you as a corporation wants to do that. And heck, maybe for the right price, the right sponsorship, you might get me to, I don't know, maybe I'll sing an opera of Mental Health Matters, a whole episode, all right? Or even if you want to do a Giving Tuesday match and have me sing, I could do that. I could do the whole podcast as like an opera. Things to think about, all right? All right. So let's get in a little bit to Mental Health Matters. The actual, purpose of this podcast, as I said, is to break down stigma and to educate on mental health issues. But who are we? What are we doing? Why are we doing this podcast on a lot of different topics, not just treatment and diagnosis? Why do we have all these different topics going on? First of all, we have about 100 employees. The majority of those are therapists, clinicians, licensed professional counselors, licensed clinical social workers, individuals that are working within 8 office locations throughout this St. Louis region. Also, we have a school partnership program. That school partnership program, we put therapists inside of schools. We embed them inside of schools to help lots of different aspects of the life of a student. So ultimately, that's who we are. Our goal is to provide counseling and psychiatric services to individuals, from kids to the seniors population. St. Louis Counseling is also one of the 8 federative agencies of Catholic Charities locally here in St. Louis. So we're our own 501c3, but we're part of the family of Catholic Charities. And we know Catholic Charities is a worldwide network of helping people in need. And the bottom line of all this is, you don't have to be Catholic to get any services. And that's something to remember. The reality is our mission calls us to help anybody in need. So today, usually we have this intriguing guests. Today it's me again. So every once in a while, I'll just do a podcast myself and just kind of bring things back to the foundation of why we do things. But ultimately, we want to be your one-stop shop for mental health. I want to be the go-to podcast, and ultimately I want St. Louis Counseling to be your go-to provider here in the St. Louis region. But since, podcasts are worldwide, right? I want to be your go-to provider when it comes to mental health topics. And as I said, just a couple minutes ago, why do we have a podcast that sometimes doesn't just talk specifically about this is depression and this is the symptoms and these are the interventions? Now, we do some of those, right? But our goal is to bring in some conversation, because mental health is, and you've heard, if you listen to the podcast before, you've heard me say this many times. Mental health, we all have our own baseline of mental health, just like physical health. We all have our own baseline of physical health. Sometimes people have a mental illness that impacts their overall mental health. Our mental health on a daily basis is up and down. It ebbs and it flows depending on what's going on in our lives. In our school partnership program, we respond to crisis situations when tragedy hits a school. So sometimes that school, that classroom, that student, that friend, they may all be handling a situation on their own levels, right? And then a tragedy hits. So then their mental health is impacted on a level that may need assistance or counseling. So when I talk about it flowing back and forth in a daily life, of course it does. Of course, our work, we have deadlines, we have stress, we have different things coming up. For me, I have it's budget planning season. Our financial controller is even more stressed out than I am, of course, but that's a different type of season for me where I'm dealing more on that level, and I'm like, it creates a lot more stress. So this podcast wants to talk about all those different things back and forth. And the reality is that we are constantly struggling to just cope with everything that goes on in our life. All right. So yes, we get into diagnoses, we get into treatment interventions, but also I want everyone to realize that mental health is just like physical health. All right. There's ebbs and flows to that. Sometimes our physical health, if you may have diabetes, you may have a disease such as when cancer strikes. So it impacts our overall physical health, just as mental health. All of a sudden, we may have a depression scenario going on. And so that level of mental health is affected. So with all that being said as well, too, I kind of want to talk about the last couple podcasts. We had a theme of talking about race and mental health through some conversations. And a lot of times what we're doing is having a conversation, and we get into talking about how a certain aspect of that person's life impacts their overall mental health. So last couple, we had Stacy Static, radio royalty here in St. Louis last week in our podcast. A couple weeks before that, we had Travis Terrell from We Are Live Radio, who were very open about mental health in general, but also the role that race and dealing with racism, dealing with just daily stressors has on their mental health as well. So, we posted some of those things. I had some interesting comments from some friends as well. They're like, we didn't really talk about, diagnosis and things like that. And it's like, well, I think what we're trying to do is bring the concepts of how mental health is woven into everything in our society to the forefront. The thing about race is a lot of times people don't have the conversation with each other to understand where the other person's coming from. So, for example, we talk about, I've been in conversations before with police officers as well as African-American moms of color, and talking about the two different perspectives. Police officer may say, why are your kids afraid of us when they get pulled over? Why are you telling your kids to, make sure that, you kiss them goodbye every day when they leave, and you're afraid something might happen? And I have moms of color in the same conversation saying, hey, you know what? It's a fact. All right. It's a fact that where I'm coming from and what I believe is there's a risk for something to happen to my kid when they leave the house, because they may do something the wrong way. And that may irritate a police officer. And I have my police officer friend at the same time saying like, hey, we're doing what we're supposed to, if people are following the rules, there's not going to be any problems. So the reality is both sides believe that, right? And until we have the conversations, how can we understand where the other person is coming from? Because I think sometimes what we forget about is the perceptions of the person experiencing it are real to them. So even if it is inaccurate, right? But that person that's believing it, that's true to them. You know, I had a friend I had a good conversation with. We'll call him BB. And BB, I'm making them listen to this podcast, the last couple. But you know I'm talking about you. But, you know, we had a good conversation one time where, you know, I grew up wanting to be a police officer. And, you know, from the earliest stages, you know, I looked at police officers as being helpful. That's who I go to when there's a problem. That's who I can feel safe with. You know, my dad was a fireman, and you know, that line of work, of course, you know, fireman and policeman, sometimes, you know, yeah, that's a little competition right there, but that's another story for another podcast. But yeah, I want to be a policeman. And when I was talking to my friend, you know, some years back, he's like, well, I grew up fearing the police. I grew up not wanting to ever dream of being a police officer, because that was the culture, and that's the family-specific culture that he grew up. The family-specific culture I grew up in, police were friends. His was not. So the only way to understand each other is that conversation, is to have these open conversations. And I think when you do that, it all comes back to, you know, maybe assisting on some mental health levels. You know, so one of the questions we were talking about is, how does race, over the last couple of podcasts, how does race affect somebody's mental health? You know, how does racism affect somebody's mental health? How does somebody feeling inadequate affect their mental health? So if you look at a person who feels inadequate because of societal norms, or because the way they have been treated, maybe over time, maybe them specifically not, but maybe family, relatives have, it impacts that level of stress. And we all know what stress does to our mental health. We all know the concept of toxic stress, living in an environment of constant stressors and traumatic events, and just day after day and minute after minute, living in that can affect your overall mental health. It shows in the brain, you know, so when you get into science and fact, you can compare to brain scans, and that helps people understand things better too. But bottom line is this, and I come back to, it is about conversation. And that's one of the things that this podcast is focused on doing, is having some conversation about some important topics to help those of you listening out there to maybe have your own conversation, or maybe you had an aha moment, like, oh, I get it now. And for myself and my friend BB, when we were talking about the role of police officers and things of that nature, it's like, I would have never dreamed that someone would be raised like that. And he said, you know, and he has specific examples on why his family felt that way and why he felt that way. And he's changed over time because he allowed himself to do that. But the reality is that until we have the conversation, we can't understand things. You know, so the last couple of weeks, there was a couple of takeaways from some of the podcasts I just kind of want to hit upon, and to kind of have some action items around if you're listening out there, because that's the thing about this podcast. It's about bettering ourselves. All right. It's about making ourselves better. And I always come back to, if you've heard me before, is know thyself. So spending time on yourself. But a couple takeaways was to, you know, listen to each other. That's the number one thing. And when you're a good listener, which means you're actually focused on the person talking, your phone is away, the people walking behind that person, you're not paying attention to them. You're actually looking into that person's eyes and listening to the words coming out of their mouth. That is a big help. You don't have to agree with them. You don't even have to understand their concepts, but you're listening to them. So one of my major takeaways from talking to Stacy and Travis is we're talking about race, and even not just talking to those guys, but just through my experiences through being in social services, is you have to listen to the person and understand where they're coming from. Because when we talk about perceptions, their perception, and as a therapist, right, I'm trained to listen, and I'm trained to kind of look at that perception that they have and to help them understand if they're on the right path to that perception or not. But the bottom line is just everyday conversation. You might be able to help improve your coworkers' mental health. You might be able to improve your kids' mental health by just being a good listener. So that was something that that was a big takeaway for me the last couple of weeks, which then leads into empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of others. So when you can do that, you can start maybe understanding on what that person might be feeling and thinking and seeing from their point of view. And that's really important when you kind of get into the discussion on race. So often I think people are afraid of the conversation, because it's sometimes racism makes it taboo. But if you're just wanting to talk about race in general, right? Why can't you have those conversations? Now, one of the things we heard some of our guests talk about is like, if I'm the only African American in a room, don't think I can speak for, my whole culture, because I can't. I can speak for myself. I can maybe speak for my family based on, the experiences I grew up in. But, that's why it's about hearing the individual experiences. So having some questions and talking about those things is really important, because that helps put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else. I don't think you can fully understand poverty until, one, you've lived it, or two, you have some open dialogue with somebody who's living in poverty and is having a hard time getting out. I use the example a lot of times when it comes to mental health is somebody, you have one side that says, go get a job and get insurance, then you can get treatment, and then you can get health care. Okay, that makes sense. You go get a job, you get some health care, because usually if you're paying through a company, health care is going to be cheaper than if you're trying to just pay out of pocket. Okay, I get that. So the problem is, you got that job, you got that, you sign up for health care for so many dollars a month, but then you go get services, right? And your copay is $80. Your copay is $100. If you're coming to mental health counseling because you're dealing with a trauma in your life or a mental health diagnosis, you might need to come weekly. And so all of a sudden, that expense is really big, because you're also trying to put gas in your car. You're also trying to pay for school lunches. There's all these things that come into play. So sometimes we have to hear a person that's dealing with these issues to fully understand it. And then we can ask questions. Well, how come you can't, do this way or do it that way or have this intervention or do this? And then you start hearing the struggles. In our rural offices outside of St. Louis County here, you hear transportation is an issue because it takes gas money to drive 15 miles one way to go get a counseling service or even, health issue taken care of. And it takes gas money. It's not that easy. That's the other thing I've seen. I digress just a quick second here. Bear with me. It's my podcast. I can do what I want, right? But the reality is some of the same issues, that we see here in St. Louis in the city compared to the issues going out into Lincoln County, Franklin County, Warren County, some of the other counties we're in. It's the same issue. It just looks a little bit different. People may look a little bit different. It's the same issue: transportation, funding for mental health, funding for health care. A lot of the same issues are there. We're all dealing with the same things. They just look a little bit different because you live in a different locale than others. But going back to those takeaways, tolerant. Tolerance is such a word that, it means like I got to tolerate it. So that's why we kind of use listening instead, and taking the time to listen. Empathy, of course. You heard me talk about that, putting yourselves in the shoes. And the only way to do that is go and talk to somebody. I'm not saying go look for someone that has a problem, but within your group of people, first of all, we know 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people are dealing with a mental health issue, right? A diagnosable mental health issue, but everybody is dealing with something. So having some conversations with that. I have friends who don't really believe in counseling. even though that's my career, and I'm like, dude, that's what I do. What do you mean you don't believe in that? But they don't really believe in that, for whatever reason. But I still listen to them. I still hear their side out. I'm still friends with them. I can still be okay with hanging out with them just because I don't agree 100% on every issue. But the reality is I do like hearing from them why they don't believe in that, and we know people don't believe in mental health still. We believe that people don't really see mental health as a true health condition. They see it as an excuse, and people are trying to get one over on us. And that's not the case. So much science behind it. But, being a good listener and working on empathy, two of these takeaways. But both of these things, when it comes down to it, means you as an individual has to, one, know thyself, and then you got to slow it down and think. All right. How often do we have the daily grind? The daily grind of you get up, if you have kids, you help them get ready for school, then you head off to work, then you get done with work. Probably it's not just a simple 8-hour day nowadays. You come home from work, you are dealing with kids' homework. If you have kids, you're dealing with bedtime, all that stuff going on. And then you turn around and do it again. We don't give ourselves time to grow as a human being. And the reality, I'm sure there'd be some good arguments out there, but aren't we all human beings? Aren't we all on this planet to kind of just live and maybe take care of each other and help each other out when we can, extend that helping hand when we can? So it all starts with understanding each other. So have that conversation with somebody, listen to somebody, try to start thinking about putting yourself in the shoes of that person, understanding where they're coming from, and then maybe you start understanding a different side of it all. I think one of the terms now is, are you woke or not? Do you understand what's going on in society? Are you taking the time to really analyze, like, man, a lot of this stuff still exists. We know there's still difference in pay between male and female. So just when you're talking about the two genders of male and female, right, there's still inequality. There is still inequality going on. So when you enter in all the different cultures, gender, all those things, we have a lot of work to do. So why not take the time to slow down and try to work on those things? It's not going to hurt. That's the other side. There's this side of being individualistic. And my job is to, be competitive, look out for number one, go after, the money in this world and make do and make it a better place for my kids. There's nothing wrong with that. But you also can't forget that what are we ultimately, right? A human being, somebody who is looking out for the community we live in. Why not give back? Why not make our community a better place to live? Why not try to tackle some of these societal issues that continuously plague our area, our cities, our region, our nation, and it's also the side of, and I know I'm getting preachy here, right? Instead of talking about mental health, but ultimately it comes back to mental health. It's helping ourselves feel better. But why not make everything not absolute? Can't we acknowledge the good in other people, even if fundamentally we may not agree with them, or they're, let's talk politics for a second. You may be on the far left. Why can't you just look at somebody on the far right and go, yeah, I agree with some of their stance. I'm sure they have a reason. We don't automatically have to assume that somebody else is deviant. Somebody else is out for bad things. Somebody else is out there to just get one over on us. Why do we assume that? I just feel a lot of times that's where we're heading. All right. Where is kind of the middle ground? There's always middle ground, and I think we're getting further and further away from that, because when we do get further and further away from that, mental health suffers. When we don't accept people for who they are, or be able to just have an understanding of who they are, we're losing out, because mental health affects every part of our society, the economy, jobs, healthcare, the cost of running a hospital, all these things, all right, affect mental health and the parts of our society. So we all have our own jobs to do. We see corporations out there having a lot more focus on wellness because they understand a healthy employee, a happy employee is a more productive employee. They're not constantly having to hire people. We see the stigma of mental health becoming less because we see more celebrities, because we put celebrities on pedestals sometimes, but they have a voice as well, which is important. All right, we see celebrities from basketball players to movie stars to politicians, whoever it may be, saying like, I have a mental health issue. I am dealing with it. This is what it is. That's progress going in the right direction. We see just mental health in general. The numbers are starting to, from services and clients, starting to climb a little bit. I think our younger generation is much more open to it than probably our older generation, but we're seeing our older generation start to go, okay, I get it. I see what you're saying. So there's progress out there, all right? So bottom line is, yes, this podcast, we're going to teach you some things about treatment and diagnoses, but at the same time, we have the conversation to help you realize that mental health is everywhere. It is surrounding us. So be a good listener. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. And then take the time to slow your mind down. Give yourself some time to think about all of it. All right? Think about what the greater good is. And think about how you, as an individual, can change someone else's world. All right? It's all good stuff. So, once again, this is Mental Health Matters. Tom Duff, Executive Director. You can find my email on our website if you have any questions. Usually can find this on Facebook and Twitter as well too, and even Instagram. I think we're moving along the world of Instagram as well too. We're getting so modern. But hey, one of the other things is help us grow this podcast by sharing it, liking it on Facebook, on Twitter, retweet it, send it out there. Why not? Right? So maybe that's one of those ways of creating, addressing the greater good. You know, you may not have time to do all this volunteering, but share a podcast like that. That's a simple click of a button. Helps us greatly as an agency, as a business, and to help others, but helps you as well, too, to know that, hey, you're trying. So share. If you're listening to this, you got all the way through this podcast. You know, it wasn't very long, not even 30 minutes probably. But hit share on Facebook, retweet it. Share our website as well too. And as I said, if you want to reach out, you can find me through social media or find me on the website. And that website, once again, is stlouiscounseling.org. Also, if you are interested in donating on Give STL Day, contact Debbie Dugan. That's DDUGAN at ccstl.org. And feel free, as I said, to share it, spread the love, help us out, do whatever you can. But until next week, when I'm sure we will have another entertaining guest, which is cool too. We're just building all this guest list up, and we've, we started this last year, and we've had some really cool guests so far. So I'm excited about the future. We're doing this at Midcoast Media Studios. They've are a great partner with us, and we are very excited to continue this on, and we will see you next week.
This has been Mental Health Matters with Tom Duff of St. Louis Counseling Services. Check out stlouiscounseling.org for more information.